Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of George Washington, and the focus is President and Precedents. The year is 1789. It's April. Washington has been elected the first president of the United States. He leaves his home in Virginia at Mount Vernon, travels to New York, where he's ready to take his oath of office as prescribed by the Constitution. They decide to do it in public in what is now called Federal Hall, the old City Hall in New York, where the U.S. Senate and House will now meet. Washington and an entourage go out onto a balcony. There's a big crowd in front ready to celebrate, and Washington raises his hand and very quietly actually utters the official oath out of the Constitution to officially become the first president. He then does something that he wasn't required to do by the Constitution, but he decides to. He gives some remarks, the first ever inaugural address. And one of the things he says is that the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps as finely staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. This is all new, worldwide, a republic based on democratic principles, and Washington is very aware that as the American experiment goes, could lead to other democratic-based systems across the world. Well, precedents are going to be a big part of what George Washington does as president, because everything he does is going to set the stage for others. In fact, he makes the point to his friend James Madison that as the first of everything in our situation will serve to establish a precedent, it is devoutly wished on my part that these precedents may be fixed on true principles. Washington is very conscious of all of the things that he's about to go do, and he wants to set a great example for posterity and all of his successors to come. Now, this includes things of grand policy, politics, as well as personal behavior, like what to wear, how to comport himself, even whom to see. You know, would he act like a royal? Would he act like something that has not been seen before? So Washington decides in this particular case that he's going to have 2 public receptions every week. Men are allowed to come in for about an hour on Tuesdays. Anybody off the street, come in, meet the president, have a few words. And then men and women will be invited to a tea party on Fridays every week. And so these were only a couple of hours out of his schedule. He thought this was a good balance so that people aren't just hounding him constantly, and he still has plenty of time to do his work, but he wants to set in the schedule these opportunities to meet the public. Another thing that he has to figure out to do is to whom to have as his advisors. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution about having a cabinet, although the first Congress passes some laws that permit the establishment of certain departments for the federal government in the executive branch. And so Washington names 4 principal leaders. He takes Henry Knox, his former general from the Revolutionary War, and makes him Secretary of War. You've got Alexander Hamilton, also from the war, now as his Secretary of the Treasury. He originally was going to ask John Jay, one of the founding fathers, to be his Secretary of State, but Jay prefers a different job, and Washington grants him the opportunity to be the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So Washington goes to his backup plan, and that's Thomas Jefferson, who's just finishing up his run as the American minister to France. So he'll be joining the cabinet a little bit late. And then there's Edmund Randolph from Virginia, another friend. He's going to be the Attorney General. There's actually no Justice Department at the time. It's literally just one person who acts as the constitutional lawyer for the president in these earliest instantiation of the Attorney General. Some presidential cabinets throughout the years are referred to as a team of rivals. I look at this one more as simply rivals. It's barely a team, in particular Hamilton and Jefferson. Now, Washington kind of knew that these two were diametrically opposed on a lot of topics going in, and he certainly got that emphasized very, very quickly in their tenure. But he also had been from the mindset of bringing the best minds as possible, giving him all the information he can get, and then he make the decision. This is how he ran the Revolutionary War with his councils of war, with his generals, and he thought a similar model might work with his administration. It was a real challenge and countless headaches for Washington throughout his tenure with this model. Now, one of the other things that Washington had to figure out how to do is to put the Constitution into practice. There's a lot of requirements in there on what the executive and the legislative and judicial branches are supposed to do, but there's also plenty of ambiguity. Well, one of these is highlighted very early on during that first Congress, when Washington and his Secretary of War, Henry Knox, negotiate a treaty with an Indian tribe. Now, treaties need to be approved by the advice and consent of the Senate. And that's according to the Constitution. You need a 2/3 vote, advice and consent of the Senate. But what does advice and consent mean? Well, Washington at the time believed advice meant he had to get the Senate's input prior to finalizing the treaty, and then he would submit it for their formal consent. So he actually handwrites out a note that he says to the Senate, I'm coming on this day to come and meet with you. It's August 21st, 1789. And he goes to the Senate and he feels humiliated. He sits there while his vice president, who's the president of the Senate, it's John Adams, is overseeing the body. While he sits there and the Senate debates about this treaty that he's been producing. This is not Washington's way. He feels, again, humiliated by the construct. He's not really allowed to speak. He just has to sit there and wait for the Senate to figure out what to do. In fact, the Senate is confused on their role. They have to send the whole thing off to a committee, and Washington leaves in a huff. And in this context, he never goes back. He reinterprets the clause in the Constitution, and this is how these interpretations started very early on. There's commas on either side of the advice and consent clause. And so he decides that advice and consent is actually one action, not two. It's not advice first and consent later. Advice and consent effectively became consent. The executive would negotiate treaties, and then it would be presented to the Senate after the fact for its up or down vote. And that's the way it's been ever since. You can imagine how different life would be if maybe the Senate had treated Washington a little bit better. We might have had a very different advice and consent process. Well, when the first congressional session comes to an end, Washington again has these ideas of meeting the public, being part of this democratic Republican environment. So he's going to go on a trip, decides to visit New England, multiple states, spends a month there and listens to the people, really learns about their economy. He visits some old Revolutionary War sites. It's a very successful trip. He actually takes two more big trips during his first term. In 1790, the following year, he goes to Rhode Island, because Rhode Island finally becomes the 13th state to ratify the Constitution. So Washington makes a trip. And in the next year, 1791, he heads south. So in his first term, he actually engages with the public from all 13 of the original states. Well, in January of 1790, policy implications start to kick in, and Alexander Hamilton, as the Secretary of the Treasury, is driving this first policy initiative. He has a plan where the federal government would assume the debts of the states. His idea was consolidating the debts, and which they were adamant that they were going to pay. They're not going to repudiate any of the debts, but they wanted to actually establish credit for the whole country. And Hamilton believed that by bringing these state debts together into a single pocket, that this would do a better job of establishing credit for the country of the United States. Thomas Jefferson adamantly opposed. He says this is just a move by the monarchists to consolidate power in the federal government, and this tension is already pretty thick in the early goings of the Washington administration. Well, this needs congressional approval, so the real voters on this topic will be the members of Congress. And so Hamilton goes to a dinner at Jefferson's house. James Madison from Virginia is there as well, aligned with Jefferson, and they work out a compromise that Jefferson and Madison will support Hamilton's plan to assume the state debts at the federal level. Hamilton will support the Southerners' wish to have the new federal capital be based in the South. It's actually going to go on the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia. The winner in all of this is George Washington, because first of all, that location is like a few miles from his home in Mount Vernon. And while he would never actually be the only president not to serve in the new capital that would bear his name, Washington, D.C., it still gratified him to be close to his home. But he also he was aligned with Hamilton's plan on the centralization of the state debt, so Washington kind of wins out all over the place. Hamilton comes up with another plan at the end of 1790, and this is to establish a national bank, again, trying to further the tight finances of this new country. Once again, Jefferson strongly opposed. There's nothing in the Constitution about establishing a national bank. It's, again, the monarchists trying to do these tyrannical processes that are going to lead to centralization of power in the hands of the federal government, so he's opposed. Washington sides with Hamilton. The big argument is a constitutional one about the necessary and proper clause and how that could be applied. And again, Jefferson is concerned if they get away with this bank, they're going to apply the necessary and proper clause to create almost anything they want at the federal level. Washington says, no, this one is justified and we'll go forward, but Jefferson is continuing to move into the camp of the opposition. There's also conflict on foreign affairs. Again, Jefferson on one side, pretty much everybody else kind of on the other, and that has to do with the revolution in France. They're following a bit in the American footsteps of overthrowing the monarchy, and in this case, putting in their own, trying to come up with a democratic system, but it's pure chaos. It's incredibly violent and bloody. Washington is not ready to commit to supporting anybody in the mess. He's going to take a sit-and-wait attitude at this point. Now, the one policy area where Washington, frankly, is a big failure in his first term has to do with relations with Native Americans, with Indians. He believed that the Indians had rights to certain lands. He wanted to negotiate treaties with them. They stay in their place. The American public would then sort of surround them possibly, but let them be. And this was unfortunately incredibly naive, because the American settlers wanted that land, and there was almost nothing, no treaty that the government was going to put in place to frankly stop them. In fact, Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, basically said he would need 50,000 troops to police these lands and these treaties in order to actually not have conflict. And for that matter, he could have said 1,000,000 troops. It was certainly never going to happen. And so eventually, as the settlers continued to encroach on the Indian land despite the treaties, the Indians started to retaliate. It started to become violent. Washington sends in the troops. He actually has setbacks. This is in 1790, 1791, where the American military is taken aback by the Indians. But then Washington gets really serious about it. He calls on Anthony Wayne, another former general from the Revolutionary War, to raise troops, train them in the arts to fight sort of the Indian style of guerrilla warfare. And by 1794, they go in. Battle of Fallen Timbers is the big fight. The American military is successful. The Indians negotiate a treaty where they give up a whole bunch of territory. And that's sort of set the tone for U.S.-Indian relations for decades and decades to come. Washington wanted something more peaceful in this area. He wrote about it. He talked about it. He tried. He simply failed in this particular regard. Well, now, by now, Washington is in his second term by the time that the Battle of Fallen Timbers occurs, but there was a question of whether or not Washington would serve a second term. He didn't really want to, and in fact, he asked his friend James Madison to help him write a farewell address. He remarked to Madison that he found himself also in the decline of life, his health becoming sensibly more infirm, and perhaps his faculties also, that the fatigues and disagreeableness of his situation were in fact scarcely tolerable to him. Well, maybe to him, but not to anybody else. If there was one thing that Washington's first-term cabinet aligned around, it was that Washington needed to serve a second term. The country was still too unstable. It needed his steady hand, and he eventually agrees. He goes to the Electoral College, has its vote. Once again, Washington is unanimously elected, and on March 4th of 1793, he is sworn in for his second term. But that's the story for another day. And that is George Washington and President and Precedents from the life of George Washington. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.